Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So today we saw the first arrest in the killing, the homicide, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We've all seen the videotape now. 4 officers restraining Mr. Floyd as Mr. Floyd is on the ground with his hands handcuffed behind his back, and one of those 4 officers, Derek Chauvin, has his knee pressed into George Floyd's throat for 9 minutes. The first 6 minutes, Mr. Floyd is still conscious. He then lapses into unconsciousness, and Derek Chauvin continues to press his knee into Mr. Floyd's throat for another 3 minutes, snuffing out his life. At this early stage of the investigation, the prosecution, we have far more questions than we have answers, but let me try to answer some of the questions I've been hearing over the past 24 hours. Some of those questions include, why did the prosecutors bring 2 different charges against Derek Chauvin, 3rd-degree murder and 2nd-degree manslaughter? Why did it take 4 days to make the first arrest in the case? What about the autopsy results that are included or referred to in the court paperwork that was filed today in conjunction with Derek Chauvin's arrest? And what about the other officers? What should happen to them? What will happen to them? Let me try to take those questions in order. First of all, as a former career prosecutor of 30 years, 22 of those years working murder cases in Washington, D.C., I can tell you it's not unusual in a case where there's only one homicide or one murder to bring charges under different theories of homicide liability. That seems to be what the prosecutors did in this case. Let me read the 2 counts that were brought against Derek Chauvin and then talk about what they mean. Okay? The first count, 3rd-degree murder, is the more serious of the 2 counts. It carries up to 25 years in prison as a potential punishment. And it reads as follows: whoever, without intent to effect the death of another person, causes the death of another by perpetrating an act that is eminently dangerous to others and evinces a depraved mind without regard for human life, is guilty of 3rd-degree murder. Importantly, that charge does not require prosecutors to prove that Derek Chauvin had a specific intent to kill George Floyd. So specific intent is not a requirement in order to prove him guilty of 3rd-degree murder. However, folks, can I tell you that when I saw that videotape and I see Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes while his fellow officers restrain Mr. Floyd, that sure looks like an intent to kill to me. But that's not required to prove him guilty of 3rd-degree murder under Minnesota law. The second count that the prosecutors brought is 2nd-degree manslaughter, and that is when a person acts in a culpably negligent way, creating an unreasonable risk to another, and death or great bodily harm results. So that is a lower level of homicide, easier to prove, and on the evidence in this case, it really, I think, understates what these officers did to George Floyd. Why did it take 4 days to obtain the first arrest warrant? I'm not privy to the evidence, so I can't say why that is. It seems like it took longer than it should have, given what we saw on that videotape. It may be that they were waiting for the medical examiner to issue his or her autopsy results, the cause and manner of death rulings in the case. And when we see what the medical examiner said he or she found, it raises some issues in my mind. And let me read from a portion of the arrest paperwork today in Derek Chauvin's case. It says that the medical examiner performed the autopsy, which revealed no physical findings that support a diagnosis of traumatic asphyxia or strangulation. Mr. Floyd, it continues, had underlying health conditions, including coronary artery disease and hypertensive heart disease. The combined effects of Mr. Floyd being restrained by police, his underlying health conditions, and any potential intoxicants in his system likely contributed to his death. Well, I have two observations about that. First of all, I am glad to see reported that the family will be using a second independent medical examiner, forensic pathologist, to perform a second autopsy to make sure what we are seeing from this medical examiner is accurate and reliable. Second, if George Floyd had some pre-existing health conditions that maybe made him somewhat more susceptible to losing his life when he's being restrained by 4 officers and having the knee of one of those officers pressed into his throat for 9 minutes, that does nothing to negate homicide liability on behalf of these officers. You take your victim as you find him. And boy, did these officers find a victim in George Floyd. Another question is, what about the other officers? Well, my view of the evidence thus far, and I haven't seen it all obviously, is that these other officers are guilty of some level of homicide in 2 different ways. First of all, those officers who took an oath to protect and defend were restraining a citizen, George Floyd, while their fellow officer had his knee pressed into Mr. Floyd's throat for 9 minutes, even after he lapsed into unconsciousness. They should have told their fellow officer, "You can take your knee off his throat. We've got him. His hands are handcuffed behind his back. He's not struggling. He's not resisting. There are 4 of us and 1 of him, and he can't defend himself." They failed in that regard. More importantly, another view of the evidence is not only did they fail to stop Derek Chauvin from what he was doing to Mr. Floyd, they assisted him. They assisted him. They saw what he was doing, and they continued to restrain George Floyd until he was dead. Those officers need to be charged with the unlawful killing, homicide, murder of George Floyd. Folks, we will be watching this case closely, and justice better come. Justice better come. Folks, please stay safe. Please stay coronavirus free. And I look forward to talking with you again tomorrow.